Um, Tonight, I'd like to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As part of the honoring of his life. And tomorrow is a holiday, which holiday means holy day, which is about really acknowledging the goodness and the blessing and the gift that he gave to all of us. And if you don't know who he is, I think most people do, but I'll say a few words about who he was. Right, he was a Baptist minister and an activist and a humanitarian and a leader in the African American civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And he was actually in a lineage of people who were active around civil rights, which because his father foreshadowed him as a civil rights leader in the South. And he was a very beautiful man. He really used his beliefs, his spirituality, his Christianity as a basis for his work and for the nonviolent civil disobedience that he introduced really en masse to the country. And he's well known for many, many things, many of the ways that he helped desegregate America and help take America out of the ignorance of the, hundreds of years of slavery and racism and bigotry. And there were so many different things he did, including the Montgomery bus boycott, which went to the Supreme Court finally, and it was the Supreme Court who said you can't discriminate in public transportation because of a long practice that he helped lead in Montgomery. And he gave a very famous speech in the March on Washington, and I wasn't at the March on Washington, but I was old enough to be aware of the March on Washington and seeing it on TV when I was a boy, and the power of it and the power of him and his speech and his presence and his love, which was really clear. And I'll say more about that as I go through this talk. But he really took the movement that he was doing and he kept expanding it. He kept deepening in his insight and understanding and his commitment to freedom, which included in terms of racism, bigotry, and the genocide of Native peoples and the enslavement of African American people. And he kept expanding his understanding, his understanding, his seeing and understanding of where freedom was needed, because he kept expanding to include poverty and all kinds of economic bias, and also against the Vietnam War, which was a big deal in the 60s, which I remember, and I remember well. And it was a big deal when he came out against the Vietnam War, because a lot of African American, a lot of Black men were fighting in the Vietnam War. And then he was assassinated. He was 39 when he died, which to me is just stunning, of what a big impact he had in a young life, because it wasn't that long that he lived. 39 to me at my age is that's first phase of life at 39. And then you get another phase like 40 to 60, and then you get another phase from 60 to 80, and then another phase. I'm not at the 80 yet, but I'm close enough. And I see it's just, 39, I was still a boy almost, really, in terms of intelligence and the kind of maturity that Dr. King displayed in all of his work. And so I'm happy to be here with all of us, in some sense, celebrating him, celebrating his life, and also acknowledging his gifts to us as a nation, as a society, and as human beings, because I see his life as having lived a bodhisattva life, A bodhisattva lives a life that's dedicated to ending the suffering of everybody. And that clearly was part of who and what he was and what he did. And he gave us a lot of gifts to help understand our own possibility for awakening beyond the ignorance and the racism and the bias that America had grown up with for hundreds of years, right? Since the 1600s. And he gave us a new understanding of how to respond to ignorance and how to respond to the dukkha of America. And if you're new here and you don't know the word dukkha, it's the Buddhist word that means suffering or dis-ease or stress but it's very broad, and it includes the hundreds of years of racism. Is all dukkha, big time dukkha, serious dukkha. And he really and all of that dukkha of racism, of enslavement, of the genocide of Native peoples was all based on the other way dukkha is understood, the way dukkha is understood not just as suffering or it's understood as the attachment to greed, hatred, and ignorance. And it's really the inability to free the mind and heart from the causes and conditions that produce us thinking we have to keep everything or get rid of something or be ignorant about the truth of what's here. And his gift was somewhat his intelligence, his maturity, his integrity, his vigor, his kindness, and his love. And that's all woven into his teachings. If you at all want to learn more about Martin Luther King, just go, do a Google search and listen to some of his talks. And you just hear the kindness and goodness and clarity and fierceness of it, about caring about the truth and freeing people from suffering. And he had this great Dharma intelligence of seeing the whole picture and seeing what was skillful and what wasn't skillful, and continually opting for skillfulness. Because again, I grew up in the 60s, and I was involved, especially in the later 60s, with a more radical political movement. And I was very much, I thought Malcolm X was great, and people like that who were very fierce about their anger, about their racism. And he was very interesting because he respected them totally, but he understood something bigger about love that it took a lot of us a long time to learn, that it's not about hating the other. It's about getting that they're unconscious, that they're ignorant, that they're deluded, and that we have to free them also. Not actively, they need to free themselves, but we need to free them, not add our hatred onto them. Use our hatred and anger to help free ourselves and free the causes and conditions that produce the kind of ignorance that bias and racism comes out of. And so he was grounded in the church and his ministry and what we would now call, and I was thinking, oh yeah, he's grounded in spirituality. And I was looking it up a little bit about Christianity as something called progressive Christianity, which what we would call in the Buddhist tradition, engaged Buddhism. But it's all based on Jesus's love for all people and Jesus's action of deconstructing hierarchy so that all people could know the love of God. And in my Dharmic understanding, Martin Luther King had a tremendous intelligence of the heart. And of course, the Buddhist way of talking about that is he knew about love, he knew about compassion, he knew about joy, he knew about equanimity, which are the four divine abodes, right? Of loving kindness and compassion and joy and equanimity, of metta and karuna and mudita and upekkha in the Pali language. And it's really the sila of the heart, the goodness of the heart, the wholesomeness of the heart, when it's aligned with the truth, is very powerful. And he knew about that power, the power of being real, the power of being aligned with his heart and really letting his heart direct his potency. And the word in Pali, and that's used in the meditative tradition that I love, is samvega. And samvega points to a kind of urgency or fierceness in terms of the actions to be taken, to be free, to awaken, both in the meditation practice and in our lives. And he knew about that kind of fierceness and the power and the dynamism and the energy of being dedicated and committed to being free. And he gave himself to it. He gave his life for it, right? And he gave himself to what he was called to do. And of course, the teaching then for us is see, what are we called to do? How can we help? In what way can we help? Because as we know in Buddhism, it's an ongoing awakening for all of us. It's not a one-time deal. You get awake and you're done. And he kept waking up as a minister, as a visionary, as a politician, and as a teacher, that as someone who changed the world and gave his life for what he loved and cared about, which was freedom, justice, intelligence, and this spiritual love. And I'll read a few quotes of his as I go on. And one of them says, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands in the way of love." I mean, that is so Buddhist on some level to me. It's like so clear and direct about power and love and goodness right there. And you hear the sila in his values and his integrity and his conscience with consciousness. My friend Sharon Salzberg said it this way, that she wrote quite a well-known book about loving kindness called Metta. And she said, loving kindness and compassion are the basis for wise, powerful, sometimes gentle, and sometimes fierce actions that can really make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of others. And that's a beautiful understanding of what Dr. Martin Luther King was able to embody and live and do. Was he had this great, wise, powerful, sometimes gentle and sometimes fierce capacity to make a difference. And his work kept deepening as he went on. He wasn't stopping. He kept going, both, as I said before, with racism and then economics and poverty, and then about the misuse of power, and then about war. And it was a big deal when he came out against the Vietnam War. He said it this way. He said, there is an element of urgency in our redirecting of American power. There's an element of urgency in the redirecting of American power. We still have a choice, nonviolent coexistence or violent annihilation. And really, he was talking during the nuclear race, between what was then Russia and the United States. It was the USSR then, right? And he said, we have a choice, a nonviolent coexistence, really with all people, or violent co-annihilation. Along the way of life, someone must have sense enough and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate. This can only be done by projecting the ethic of love into the center of our lives. And it's beautiful understanding of the sure heart's release, what's called the sure heart's release in Buddhism, which is about the goodness of the human heart when it's free, and projecting that ethic of love into the center of our lives. And of course, he I don't know if he knew this, but if he echoes the Buddha. He said, darkness cannot be driven out by darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Right? Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And the Buddha had said earlier, in this world, hate never yields to hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and inexhaustible, sometimes translated as ancient and eternal. Right? In this world, the Buddha said, hatred never yet drives out hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and eternal. And this really, the appreciation of love and goodness and heartfulness and wholeheartedness is so woven into everything he did and how he spoke about it. When he gave his acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, he was the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said, I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. And he's really talking about how to stick with it, even when it's difficult, even when it's not going the way we want, because there's something deeper that we're embodying when we fight for truth, for freedom, with the equality of all of us. And he pointed, part of his wisdom was understanding what we call in Buddhism interconnectedness. The interconnectedness of all things, that we're all, even though we're all separate, like you're all in your little boxes here on the screen, but really there's just one thing, there's just consciousness, and it's in all of us, and it's part of all of us, is one way to think about it. And that there's a shared humanity, no matter what the particulars may be, whether we're, white or black or gay or straight or, transgendered or whatever the differences may be, whether we're rich or poor or educated or uneducated, there's still what in Buddhism's called the precious human birth, the precious human heart. And it's part of something we all share. It's the goodness that we all are part of. And he said it this way. He said, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. We're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together into a single garment of destiny. It's such beautiful Dharma to me, of what he's saying, because it's all right here. It's this moment. We're woven together in this moment, no matter what. And it's totally, it's magical, but it's right here. We're all right here. Life is right here in this moment. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly, he went on to say, right? We're tied together in this single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are all made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. And it's as deep a Dharma as I know, is what he's saying, right? Because of this interrelated structure of reality, we're all one on one level, and we're all impacted by one another at the same time. Pema Chodron said that compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. And it's what Martin Luther King understood and what he knew, and what he manifested was that kind of compassion of our shared humanity. The wonderful teacher, Bhikkhu Bodhi, who was teacher of some of my teachers, he said it slightly differently. He said the entire cosmos is a cooperative. The entire cosmos is a cooperative. The sun, the moon, and stars live together as a cooperative. The same is true for humans and animals and trees and the earth. When we realize that the world is a mutual, interdependent, cooperative enterprise, then we can build a noble environment. If our lives are not based on this truth, that the world is a mutual, interdependent, cooperative enterprise, that if our lives are not based on this truth, then we will all perish. Couple last pieces about Dr. Martin Luther King. This is he talked about when there were a number of young children murdered in 1963. And he said the most interesting thing in response to it, he said, we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them. We must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. And you hear, I hope you hear, he's pointing at the causes and conditions which Buddhism is always wanting to see. What's the cause and conditions of this moment, of this action, of our wisdom or our ignorance? So the more we can understand it, the more we can start to free ourselves and others. And it's what he pointed at in his eulogy for these four killed children. And Clarence B. Jones, who's a diversity professor at USF and a scholar writer at the MLK Junior Institute at Stanford, who was a former personal advisor, lawyer, and draft speechwriter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said this, he said, Dr. King would still carry within him the resonating voice of Rabbi Joachim Prinz at the 1963 March on Washington. So this is a rabbi speaking at the March on Washington. And the rabbi had survived the Holocaust in Europe. And he said, when I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people, he's talking about the German people, a great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of silent onlookers. America must not remain silent. Then the last piece I'll say about Reverend King is about his Dāna, about his generosity, because he really gave himself to things that I believe we all love: freedom, happiness, harmony, intelligence, ethics, integrity, and the hope that we could live together in an intelligent and awakened way. And he really gave his life for all of that. And he was inspired to give this, given his calling. And that's something for us to all reflect on day by day, is how can we give to the world? How can we give to ourselves? How can we give to the world? And it doesn't mean I'm not going to become Dr. Martin Luther King. We're called in different ways. And he had his calling. And even the small callings we have to help a neighbor or a friend or a stranger in whatever way we can, those are important callings to give to our world, to our society. And he was inspired by different people who gave. And I was noting this as I was reflecting about him and reading about him. And one of the people who really inspired him was Rosa Parks, who was a woman who started the whole changing the whole system of transportation, because she rejected what a bus driver told her to do, ordered her to relinquish her seat in the, quote, colored section, because that's what people called it, the colored section of the bus, to a white passenger after the white-only section was filled. And she refused to do it. And she went to jail for that. And she inspired Martin Luther King by her boldness and her courage and her birthright as a human being to be free and to be respected. And he was also deeply, deeply inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma Gandhi was a lawyer who gave up his life really to free India from British rule. And he was a father of Satyagraha, which was nonviolent resistance, which Dr. King inherited from him. And he really loved Gandhi and what Gandhi taught. And Gandhi said this, he said, consciously or unconsciously, every one of us does render some service or another. This is another way to think about Dāna. Consciously or unconsciously, every one of us does render some service or another. If we cultivate the habit of doing this service deliberately, our desire for service will steadily grow stronger, and it will make not only for our own happiness, but for the happiness of the world at large. That was from Mahatma Gandhi. And then the last thing I'll say is really from Coretta Scott King, who was Dr. King's wife. And she said, when Martin talked about the end of his mortal life in one of his last sermons, even then he lifted up the value of service as a hallmark of a full life. He said, I'd like somebody to mention on the day Martin Luther King died that he tried to give his life serving others. He said, I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to love and serve humanity. So those are a few thoughts on this, on the eve of this holiday honoring Dr. King.